Keith stayed on his rock while I worked with the trills. I tried to stay as focused as possible because this was important.
You said Keith was maimed. He lost a lot, more than anyone should have to bear. Our science can aid, but only to an extent. And even if there were a cure out there are no doctors here to help him. Is there a way to help him, or even just to be able to not feel the pain?
They silently conferred between one another for a moment.
We are not familiar with your minds, but we can limit our exposure. We were unready when we contacted his mind, and it overwhelmed us. For our kind, we do not only hear the thoughts, but feel the emotions, experience the memories. His mind, it is a constant maze of pain, grief, loss, and fear. The terror of what would happen to the Rothany if he did not make it to them, it is strange. His memory does not have them as close to him emotionally, and yet terror at the prospect of the deaths of people who are his competitors. He fears for you, that you will come to understand how he feels, but he desires understanding, and we do not know how to process this. We lack a term for it.
Cognitive dissonance. His mind is essentially fighting a war with itself, and as to his emotional state, he's been through way too much. Things happen that are so horrible that his own identity as a person. He believes in people, he's kind, and wants people around him, but he's so terrified of losing anyone else that the very thing he craves is the one thing he's afraid of having.
I shrugged, figuring I might as well lay out the direct truth. They both nodded in unison.
Thank you for your explanation. It is difficult for us, with beings who are not as we. Until we came here, we had never encountered lies or deceptions, nor would any of our people understand them. Other species, however, seem to embrace them. This will make a fascinating field of research for our people. And it is a unique opportunity to be able to observe this grouping. We thank you for including us in your plans.
I began leading them the rest of the way into camp.
You're welcome, but the plan is Keith's, not mine. Everyone seems to be gathering up around the fire for dinner.
Dinner was a slight awkward with the trills, and I spent a lot of it smoothing ruffled feathers, as the others were not used to the trills. Keith spent some more time in his meditation before coming down for dinner. He approached the fire cautiously, monitoring the trills, and bowed his head.
I'm sorry to y'all for earlier. I'd have taken precautions if I'd known.
They bowed their heads as he had and projected acceptance to the group at large. Everyone save for the trills and Keith ate ravenously, the trills not needing food and Keith just sort of eating normally. I smiled.
Well, I'm glad to know everyone's enjoying my cooking.
Azoku held up a piece of smoked leg meat.
Yes, indeed. Fortunate we are that we live with your species' finest cook.
Keith nearly choked for a second, laughing, then motioned at me.
I mean, it's great, don't get me wrong, Val, but yeah, even she'd be the first to tell y'all this ain't our best cuisine. Hell, we're mostly guessing at how to cook things here.
Once again, the eyes of all species were regarding us, and Azoku sat forward, an intense look on his face, and his tail swept the ground behind him.
There is better food than this in your world?
Greltha sat forward here.
Oh yes. Some of their earth foods were sent after we arrived. Something called pizza and ice cream sandwiches. We thought they were spoiling us. Sadly, it did not last long.
I looked at my food.
Oh yeah, this isn't even close. And even those weren't the pinnacle of human foods. I mean, I've done what I can, but options are limited. So like, when I did the cougar meat, we added these spring onions to it, and mushrooms to enhance the flavor, alongside smoking the meat. Or the fish. We wrapped in these large leaves with some various local herbs, but our options here are pretty limited. Hey, shit. We need names for these two we can actually say.
Keith only took a moment.
Hearth and Prodigal.
They were close to the actual sensation I'd gotten, so it fit.
All right, Hearth Prodigal. Could you do me a favor? I'm trying to explain earth foods, but I'm afraid something might get lost in translation. Could you project memories of food from my mind to everyone else's as I talk about it?
They nodded, and I felt their touch on my mind as I began.
I mean, even just this food, we could make better on Earth. For one, we could marinate, which would make the meat more tender and flavorful. We'd also have access to things such as cheese and bread. Heck, just having salt and pepper would make some pretty serious strides. That's not even considering regional dishes, or what we have at cooking competitions.
eyes bulged and Ragnar was wiping saliva from his mouth. Keith, meanwhile, had gotten some sort of epiphany and was marking something down in charcoal, then passed it to me. Potato flour.
Oh my God, Keith! That's brilliant! We just need more yams and get them all cooked up and dried. If we could get some salt and sugar, we'd be able to make all sorts of stuff.
I felt the presence of the trills pull back, and at first I thought it might be Keith, but apparently, as the possibilities in my mind started blooming, it was getting to be too much for them, the equivalent of someone rapidly screaming in your ear out of nowhere. The others were fixated on this, and even without telepathy, it was evident that they wanted to try however much of the foods they'd seen from my memories as they could. Ducatha was the first to breach the conversation between me and Keith.
Where do we get salt and sugar?
Well, salt we could get from the ocean. We take the seawater and boil it down until we have almost no water left, just enough to keep the salt from burning. Then we just strain it, and we have sea salt. Sugar might be a problem, though. Generally, sugarcane only grows in tropical climates on Earth.
Keith put a hand up and responded as I looked at him.
Well, actually, one of the farms round where I grew up grew sugar beets as one of their regular crops. Same basic concept as growing the yams. Then we just process them down for the sugar. The beets grow northern.
Everyone began talking back and forth from there, working out how to search for various ingredients. Even Azaku was up for it, offering no complaints. None of the others could read our booklet guide for plants, but that gave Keith something to focus on. The trills excused themselves as evening fell, to enter dormancy, as they put it, and our tribe developed a game plan for getting tastier food. In the morning, Keith jolted awake again, wiping tears from his eyes, but unwilling to talk about it, he stalked off down to the river to check his nets and wash up. He would also likely be doing whatever it was he did every morning to get himself in the right headspace. It was hard watching him go through this, especially with no ability to offer real help. I could give him all the hugs and encouragement on Earth, and it still would be a minor break at best. I got things ready for breakfast. In order to have a bit more variety, we had taken to doing fish in the mornings, with jackalope meat for lunch, usually a stew, and cougar meat for dinner. The trills were up, and Prodigal came up while I was working.
Keith's mind is strange.
I shrugged, not quite awake. God, I missed coffee.
Oh, he's been having some bad dreams lately, I think, but he doesn't want to discuss them, and given his history, I can understand it.
That assessment is incorrect. Your species' dreams and his dreams were far from what I would expect given our experiences with him. Given his experiences, we expected that Keith's mind would be as tormented as waking, or that it would be quiet, but it is not. His sleeping mind is quite active, almost more than when he is awake, and his mind feels joy, contentment, togetherness, and love. It is only as he wakes that the fear and anger comes out in waves. I committed a breach of etiquette in the night, and I must make amends. But his mind was so quiet I could not halt my own curiosity, and looked through his sleeping mind. There were no fears, no trauma. His mind was completely in balance. He was simply with a woman and a female human child. Kendra and Heather, I believe he referred to them as.
Oh, Christ.
His wife and daughter, they died.
How can they be dead? His mind paints them as very much alive, and he was happy.
I took a breath as I came to understand the deepest part of Keith's horror.
He isn't having nightmares. He screams awake because he's waking up. He goes to sleep at night, and they're alive. Then, in the morning, he has to reconfront their deaths. He wakes up every morning to relearning that his wife and daughter are dead.
Keith's life was a quite literal living hell, and every night he would get some degree of relief, only to be plunged back into the fire every morning. Then he would spend his entire day trying like hell to keep all of us alive and keep things moving forward and repeat the cycle. Something had to give, and if I didn't find a way to relieve the pressure, the one who gave would be Keith. I finished breakfast for the tribe and held myself together enough to make it back into the shelter, engage the privacy mode, and collapse into my hammock before sobbing uncontrollably. Prodigal had talked about what Keith went through, and that would have been bad enough, but it wasn't just words. As the trills had said, it was the memories and emotions that went with it. In one moment, I'd felt the joy Keith had returning home to his family, holding them both, playing with his daughter, singing to her as he held her in his arms. Then this hook in my chest as I felt it all being ripped away, the inhuman scream as he realized it was a dream, and the fight in his mind to stay, to never wake, to pull himself back to them, and the absolute knowledge it would fail. When I came out of it, I was in the fetal position, hugging my knees as the privacy mode timer ran out. I'd felt one moment, and it was too much. Meanwhile, I could hear the sound of Keith outside, arranging the day with the others. I wanted to get up from that hammock, but there was no energy left in my body. Meanwhile, the man whose pain it truly was outside, getting everything moving. I fell asleep for a time after that, only awakening when Ducatha came to check on me.
Lady Val, are you okay?
I startled awake, but calmed looking into Ducatha's pink eyes.
I'll be okay. The trills saw into Keith's mind, and they were explaining what he was going through, and it was too much. I just needed some time. Let's get going on lunch, shall we?
I worry about Keith. He's always really nice, and he's been teaching me and Shin some stuff. And apparently he needs a guitar so he can let us hear some Earth music.
Ducatha moved alongside me as I went out and began the day's work. Most were out of the camp, including Keith, which I asked Ducatha about.
Oh, Keith's down at the river. He's doing something called water therapy for his shoulder, and Shin is scouting around him. He thumps in every so often.
I was familiar with water-based physical therapy, and Keith, being an EMT, likely had more knowledge of it than I did. With no proper weights and other equipment, it made sense. Water would make the movements of his injured shoulder a lot easier. It would also give him something to do now.
That's a good thing. How do you feel about a nickname?
Her ear went to the side.
What's a nickname?
It's a shorter name for people that know you well. For instance, my name is Valerie, or Val for short, which I prefer.
I remarked easily as I started arranging supplies. Hearth was still in camp, Greltha and Ragnar were well asleep, and everyone else was gone, so I turned to Hearth.
Hearth, can you reach Prodigal? I'm preparing to head out, and I need him. Also, how far can your telepathy extend between one another?
I have relayed your message, and as long Prodigal does not cross the horizon, I can maintain contact with him.
Well, there's an ability Keith is going to have a field day with.
All right. As to you, how about Ducky?
She smiled and her nose twitched.
Ducky's good. Where are we going?
Myself, Shin, and Prodigal are going out to find others. Keith's plan calls for everyone to be present, and we still have a lot of species to gather. So I need you to grab Shin and then stay with Keith, in case he overexerts himself. There's a saying on our world, doctors make the worst patients. So make sure he doesn't hurt himself,
I said, gathering up packs and equipment for the trip. Ducky nodded, her entire body now serious, and shot down the side of the bluff toward the river. Moments later, up came Shin.
Hey, we're getting more tribe mates? I know where some are.
We finished making ready and left as Prodigal got close to camp. With the trills able to freely communicate over distance, we could relay information quickly when we needed to, even specific information. As well, their telepathy itself meant we could cut down the time we needed to work on translations. Shin did indeed know his way around, although not specific directions. Prodigal rendered that point moot, however, as he was able to reach out and feel for minds around him. So once Shin got us close, it was just a matter of Prodigal taking a moment to pinpoint exact location, although his range for that was nowhere near what his range with Hearth was. It could be familiarity or species thing, but it was still a massive advantage. There were no real hurdles as we walked, and with Shin leading the way, we made good time heading back toward the coast. The wind seemed to be shifting, and by the clouds we were seeing from the bluff, we would need those shelters up somewhere soon. Even if the weather hadn't reached us yet, it wouldn't be long now. It was still spring, and those rains would be coming now. Going over what would be needed got interrupted eventually by Shin, who thumped the ground just before our wristbands beeped. The green light was blinking, and we each pressed our button. The holographic screen came up, and Ravaj Teak was there in full form.
Welcome back, viewers, for another exciting episode of Pre-Warp Survival. Today, we have the different groups of survivors coming together, and it looks as though only one species may make it through this conflict. And what's this? Our first alliance led by the human survivor Val approaching the area. Are they here to trade? To fight? We will be broadcasting this conflict live.
We sped up. They were somewhere around here if we were being included in the announcement. Prodigal moved with urgency.
Val, I believe I can sense aggression in this direction.
It wasn't exact, but it was enough, and Shin started picking up noise from up ahead. We broke into a clearing where 3 other teams were. First, the Vendricks, and they were definitely more reminiscent of elves from Earth fantasy stories. They were thin, with more defined cheekbones and long pointed ears. Across from them were a pair of impressively sized ghoul. The male one had olive green skin, a pair of small tusks protruding from his lower lip and bellowed across at the Vidrix, while his female companion looked ready to fight, her skin gray. Finally, and smallest of the groups, the Skrens, some sort of humanoid rat species, and all 3 were staring at a fresh kill. It was a big beast, something like an elk on Earth, but its horns did not stand up, but came down along its head. All 3 shared a trait in common. They clearly hadn't eaten in a bit, and none were willing to give up a chance at so much food. They all looked as the 3 of us entered the clearing, getting nervous as we broke through the trees. Prodigal gave a warning. Careful, they are all prepared to kill.
Prodigal, transmit my words to their minds. Everyone, stop fighting. We have food and clean water on us, enough for all of you to be fed. We do not need to be enemies. We have a home, we're building shelters, and access to regular water and food.
I could only hope that they would be willing to listen, and we started to pull out food to offer, as well as the boon bags. And that's when it went wrong. As the others hesitated, the Skrens decided it was a good time to go for the kill. The ghoul immediately rushed in with the Vendrix shortly after them. The fight had begun, and if we wanted them all to listen, we would need to first end the fight, and there was only one language they were all speaking right now.
Hey everyone, hope you loved the video. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit subscribe for more awesome sci-fi content. You can also support us by hitting the thanks button or becoming a channel member. Your generosity helps us bring you more stellar stories. Every bit counts. Thanks a bunch.